where the quietest moments speak the loudest truths. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is sing a song that someone once forgot the melody to. And today's story begins just like that, with a soft lullaby sung in a hospital hallway, and ends with a father rising from his seat in tears, saying just 5 words. I heard every note. If you believe, like we do, that a simple song sung at the right moment can reach places medicine never will, then take a second to like this video, and stay with us until the end. Because today, a young woman was fired for singing to a silent child, but what happened next gave her everything back. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the sunlight filtered gently through the high windows of the Los Angeles Children's Hospital cafeteria, casting warm, golden rectangles across the pale tile floor. The lunch rush had long passed. The nurses had gone back to their rounds, parents had retreated to waiting rooms, and the once bustling space had settled into a hush broken only by the faint hum of vending machines and the occasional rattle of a food tray. Hannah Blake, 26, moved quietly from table to table, wiping down surfaces and stacking stray napkins. Her dark green uniform, slightly faded at the seams, bore the name tag, Hannah, Food Services. But anyone who worked the afternoon shift knew she was more than that. She was the one who remembered the names of the kids who stayed too long, who noticed when a parent looked like they hadn't slept, who brought extra applesauce to room 409 because the little girl in there only liked the cinnamon kind. Today, like most days, Hannah had finished her prep early and volunteered to clean up the common area. It wasn't in her job description, but she didn't mind. It gave her time to think, and more importantly, it gave her a chance to pass by the pediatric ward window on her way back. That's where she first saw him. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was curled up on the cushioned bench by the tall corner window that overlooked the parking lot. He wasn't reading or coloring like the other kids. He wasn't playing with the donated toys or watching cartoons on the wall-mounted TV. He just sat there, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around his legs, head resting against the cool glass as if trying to disappear into it. There was something still about him. Not the stillness of rest, but the kind that came from too much sadness. The kind that didn't belong to a child. Hannah paused, keeping a respectful distance. She'd seen plenty of kids come through this wing, some fighting illnesses their bodies could barely handle, some waiting for surgeries, some there because they didn't have anywhere else to go. But this boy, he didn't move. He didn't flinch when the automatic door hissed open behind her. He didn't glance when a nurse wheeled a tray past. He just stared out, eyes fixed on nothing, like sound and color had stopped meaning anything to him. She looked around. No parents nearby. No doctors. No volunteers at that moment. Just her. Hannah quietly stepped to a cleaning cart and pulled out a fresh cloth, pretending to polish a nearby handrail. But her eyes kept drifting back to him. There was something aching about the way his small fingers tapped lightly against his jeans, like he wanted to reach for something, but no longer knew how. She didn't know his name. Didn't know why he was here. Didn't know if he was waiting to go home, or waiting to never go home again. But she knew what it felt like to be unseen. To sit in a crowded room and feel like a ghost. And for some reason, perhaps instinct, perhaps something deeper, she didn't want him to feel that way. Hannah glanced around one more time, then took a few slow steps toward the bench. Not too close. Just near enough for her voice to carry. She didn't speak. She didn't ask if he was okay, or where his mom was, or why he looked so lost. She didn't want to startle him, or force him to answer questions he wasn't ready for. So instead, she sat down on the floor across from him, rested her back against the wall, and softly began to hum. A gentle, familiar tune. One nearly every American child had heard at some point in their life, passed from grandmothers to daughters to newborns wrapped in soft blankets. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. Her voice was quiet. Not performance quiet, comfort quiet. She sang as if only the walls were listening. But something in the air shifted. The boy's fingers stopped tapping. Then slowly, his head turned. Not fast, not dramatic. Just a slight tilt, as if hearing something through fog. Their eyes met. Hannah gave the faintest smile, still singing under her breath. She didn't reach out. She didn't move. She just stayed. And for the first time all day, the boy didn't turn away. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But he saw her. And in this place, where children were often treated like broken machines instead of whole, feeling people, that was everything. Hannah sat still for a long moment, her back resting gently against the cool wall tiles across from the boy. The hallway was hushed, the only sounds a faint beeping from a distant monitor and the soft whoosh of air from a hospital's ventilation system. The boy hadn't moved again. He had turned his head once to glance at her, and that alone had felt like a miracle. She didn't know if she should stay. This wasn't her job. She wasn't trained in pediatric care. No one had asked her to intervene. She was just a cafeteria worker, someone with a name tag and a mop bucket, not someone with a clipboard or a stethoscope. But something about that glance, the flicker of acknowledgement in the child's eyes, it wouldn't let her go. So Hannah did what she always did when words felt too big and moments too fragile. She sang. Barely above a whisper, her voice tiptoed into the quiet like a secret. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. She didn't plan it. She didn't ask herself whether she had the right. It was just a song that lived somewhere in her, tucked between memories of rainy days and her grandmother's rocking chair, between scraped knees and arms that had once held her through childhood sadness. Her voice wasn't perfect. It cracked slightly, low and soft, worn from years of not being used for anything but humming along to the radio while doing dishes. But it carried something more important than polish. It carried intention. Across from her, the boy didn't react at first. His knees remained drawn to his chest, his gaze still unfocused, head pressed against the window. But by the second line, "You make me happy when skies are gray," something changed. He turned his head. Slowly, tentatively. And then he looked at her. His eyes were wide. Not frightened, not quite, but alert. Aware. Hannah kept singing, her eyes never leaving his. She softened her tone even more, careful not to break whatever invisible thread had just formed between them. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But he blinked, and this time, it felt intentional. It felt like acknowledgement. Hannah shifted slightly, drawing her knees up just a little, mirroring his posture in a gentle subconscious show of solidarity. She wasn't trying to fix him or reach some breakthrough. She was just being there. With him. In his quiet. When she reached the final line of the verse, her voice trembled, not with fear, but with emotion. Please don't take my sunshine away. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't cry. Instead, his gaze held hers, longer than she thought possible. And then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulder relaxed. Just a little. Just enough for her to notice. It was the kind of moment no camera could capture, no chart could record. He was still silent. Still cocooned in whatever world he had built to protect himself from everything outside. But now, Hannah was there too. And he hadn't pushed her away. She let the final note fade into the air, not forcing anything more. No follow-up words. No coaxing. She didn't need him to do anything else. That was the beauty of music, she had always believed. It didn't ask for answers. It didn't need permission. It just filled in the spaces where pain had built its walls. The boy turned his head slightly back toward the window, but this time, he didn't retreat into himself completely. He stayed turned halfway, as if still listening, as if hoping the melody might return. Hannah smiled faintly, then leaned her head against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She didn't know if it mattered. Didn't know if anyone would notice. Or care. But she had done something small. Something kind. Something no one had told her to do, but something her heart had asked of her. And in that still hospital hallway, with fluorescent lights buzzing above and distant footsteps echoing down the corridor, It felt like that small thing was everything. The air between them hung in stillness, fragile as glass. Hannah remained on the floor, her knees tucked gently beneath her, hands resting loosely in her lap. The final note of "You Are My Sunshine" had faded just seconds ago, yet it still seemed to hum in the quiet of the corridor. She didn't move, didn't speak, as if afraid the slightest sound would shatter the small miracle that had just taken place. A boy's glance, a softened gaze, a moment of shared presence. And then, it happened. Just as she was about to lower her head and perhaps sing another verse, Hannah felt the lightest tug on her sleeve. She looked down slowly, careful not to startle him. The boy's hand, small, pale, trembling ever so slightly, had reached across the short space between them and taken hold of the hem of her shirt. Not with force. Not in panic. But gently, almost cautiously, like a child who wasn't sure if the world would let him hold on. Her breath caught. It was nothing dramatic. He didn't speak. He didn't cry out or throw himself into her arms like in some made-for-TV moment. He just touched. Quietly. Deliberately. As if that single point of contact was his way of saying, "I'm still here." His fingers gripped the fabric with only the barest pressure, as though afraid even this would be too much. Hannah didn't move an inch. She just looked at him, and in that gaze was something that didn't need words. She saw him. And he saw her back. Around the corner, footsteps echoed softly, slow, measured steps of someone not in a hurry. A nurse in navy scrubs appeared, carrying a clipboard and adjusting her lanyard. She was halfway down the hall when she caught sight of the scene, a cafeteria worker on the floor, legs crossed, a silent boy curled beside the window, and a tiny hand holding onto the hem of her shirt. She froze. For a second, she blinked as though her mind had to recalibrate what her eyes were seeing. In her years working the pediatric ward, she had seen all manner of heartbreak, tantrums, screaming, children withdrawn so deeply into themselves they no longer responded to light or sound. But this kind of tenderness? From him? The nurse knew the boy. Everyone on the third floor did. He had been there for over 2 months, mostly unresponsive, diagnosed with acute trauma-related mutism. No one, not the doctors, not the therapists, not even the volunteers trained in pediatric emotional support, had ever coaxed so much as a glance from him. And yet here he was, holding on to someone. A cafeteria worker. Silently, the nurse slipped her phone from her pocket. Not to post. Not to share. Not for any reason other than this. She knew no one would believe her unless she showed them. She pressed record and zoomed in slowly, carefully, framing the small scene in her screen without moving closer. There was reverence in her stillness, the kind one might show at a cathedral or sacred place. Because that's what it felt like in that moment. Sacred. Hannah hadn't noticed her yet. Her eyes were still locked with the boy's, her body completely still, voice quiet. Almost instinctively, she began to hum again, the tune even softer this time, barely more than a breath. The boy's fingers twitched but didn't let go. The nurse felt her throat tighten. She stopped recording after a few seconds, lowered the phone, and took a quiet step backward, not wanting to break whatever connection had just formed. She stood at the end of the hallway, hand to her chest, watching as the boy leaned ever so slightly forward, just enough that his head nearly touched Hannah's shoulder. He didn't collapse into her. He didn't speak. But the gesture was loud in a place where silence had become his only language. And Hannah? She just kept humming. Not a full verse. Not even words. Just the rhythm. Just the warmth of a song passed through air. She didn't ask what the boy's name was. She didn't wonder what had happened to him. All she knew was that in this small moment, she had been chosen, not by authority, not by training, but by something far deeper, trust. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next morning, the hospital cafeteria smelled of scrambled eggs, burnt toast, and sterilized tile. Trays clattered against metal counters as the breakfast rush rolled through. Hannah Blake moved through her routine with quiet precision, hair tied back neatly, apron freshly pressed, eyes a little more tired than usual. She hadn't told anyone about what happened the day before. Not the other cafeteria workers. Not the janitor who usually swapped jokes with her during morning setup. Not even the night nurse who always smiled and offered her leftover pudding cups. Something about it felt too fragile to speak aloud. That single moment, a child's hand brushing against her sleeve, had been more than she could explain. She didn't want to reduce it to words, didn't want to risk someone laughing or brushing it off as an exaggeration. So she tucked it away. Quietly. Like a keepsake. By 9:15 a.m., the breakfast crowd had thinned, and Hannah had just started restocking the juice cooler when her name came over the intercom. "Miss Blake, please report to administration. Immediately." The woman at the register looked up, eyebrows raised. "Sounds official." Hannah gave a small nod, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her way down the long corridor toward the administrative wing, a place she rarely had reason to enter. The walls here were colder, cleaner somehow, as if warmth had been deliberately scrubbed away. When she reached the office door, a receptionist gestured silently for her to go inside. Her supervisor, Mr. Klein, was already seated behind a wide desk. A second person, someone from HR she assumed, stood near the filing cabinet, arms crossed. A thin folder lay open on the desk. Hannah remained standing. Mr. Klein cleared his throat. "Miss Blake," he began, his tone clipped, "we've reviewed a report concerning an interaction that occurred yesterday during your shift." She said nothing. "The report includes visual evidence," he continued. "You were seen engaging directly with a pediatric patient, outside of your assigned duties, and without medical clearance or authorization." Hannah blinked, then lowered her eyes. The silence pressed in. "We understand," the HR representative added, "that your intentions were not malicious. However, hospital policy is very clear. Only authorized personnel may engage in patient care or contact." "It wasn't care," Hannah said softly. Mr. Klein didn't respond. He simply flipped a paper from the folder and slid it across the desk. "This is a formal notice of suspension, effective immediately. You are temporarily relieved of duties pending further review. This is not a termination. But it is serious." The words were sharp, impersonal. Like someone reading from a script. Hannah looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. Her hands stayed at her sides. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised, either. Part of her had known the moment she saw the nurse reach for her phone, had known that kindness, in a place like this, could be misread. "I understand," she said quietly. The HR representative softened, just a little. "We're not saying what you did was wrong in spirit. But we can't allow staff to make personal decisions about patient interaction. You understand that, right?" Hannah nodded once. Mr. Klein looked mildly relieved. No protest. No argument. No scene. He hated drama. "You may gather your belongings," he said, "and we'll notify you once the review concludes." She turned and walked out. No one in the cafeteria knew. No one stopped her. She folded her apron, placed it gently in the staff cubby, and walked through the back door into the parking lot where the morning sun had grown harsh and uninviting. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just sat in her car for a while, staring at the steering wheel, trying to decide if she'd made a mistake, if humming a lullaby to a silent boy had been worth all this. But then she remembered the way he looked at her. The way his hand had reached out, not for help, not for pity, but for connection. And she decided it was. By late afternoon, the corridors of the hospital were once again filled with the soft sounds of pagers, intercom announcements, and the rhythmic squeak of carts being wheeled across polished floors. On the third floor, the pediatric wing had settled into a lull, children resting, staff preparing for the shift change. No one suspected that something was about to disrupt the usual rhythm. At exactly 3:42 p.m., the main administrative line lit up with a call flagged as urgent. The receptionist picked up, her tone routine and professional, until the voice on the other end said calmly, "This is Leonard Grayson. I'd like to speak with your hospital director. Now." It wasn't a request. It was the voice of a man used to making things happen. Within 20 minutes, the hospital's executive team had been assembled in the conference room on the top floor. The air was taut with confusion and anticipation. Leonard Grayson, 60 years old, founder and CEO of the Grayson Group, a real estate and philanthropic empire worth billions, was one of the hospital's top benefactors. His name was etched into the plaque outside the new pediatric wing. He was known for being generous, but also precise, strategic, not prone to casual visits. When he walked into the room, he didn't shake hands. He didn't sit. He placed a small digital recorder on the table, pressed play, and let the room listen. It was a recording, audio only, faint and slightly distorted. But the melody was unmistakable. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." No one spoke. The song filled the space with a strange kind of weight, too soft to interrupt, too powerful to ignore. Then came a small rustle, followed by the barely audible sound of breath, a child's breath. And then, silence again. Leonard pressed stop. "That," he said, his voice low but unwavering, "was taken from the sensory monitoring system in my son's recovery room." The executives looked at each other, startled. No one in the room had realized, or perhaps had forgotten, that Leonard Grayson's only son, Nathaniel, age 7, had been recovering in near total silence in that very hospital for the last several months following a traumatic accident. The boy hadn't spoken, hadn't responded to therapy, had barely acknowledged the presence of doctors or nurses. His condition was known only to a few, kept deliberately private. Until now. Leonard looked around the room, pausing to meet every pair of eyes. "I wasn't there yesterday," he said, "but I've listened to this recording 20 times in the last 24 hours. And what I felt, was that for the first time since the accident, my son responded to something. Not because of medication. Not because of a chart. But because someone sang to him." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "I've read the disciplinary notice," he continued. "I've seen the suspension papers issued to one of your food service workers, Hannah Blake." A few shoulders stiffened. Leonard leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something. Which one of you taught her that? Which one of you trained her to reach my son when no one else could?" Silence. "She doesn't have a medical license. She doesn't have a therapy degree. But she reached him. You're telling me you punished her for that?" A senior administrator cleared his throat. "Mr. Grayson, with all due respect, our policies." Leonard raised a hand, and the man fell silent. "I want to meet her," Leonard said. "Today." There was no threat in his voice. No yelling. No legal jargon. But the weight of his words was unmistakable. He didn't ask. He required. Someone nodded hesitantly, pulling out a phone. As the meeting adjourned, murmurs filled the hallway. Some were defensive, others embarrassed. But all understood one thing: something had shifted. Not because of a headline. Not because of a lawsuit. Because a billionaire father had heard a song, and recognized what everyone else had overlooked. The call came just after 5 p.m., when the sunlight was turning amber and long shadows began to stretch across the staff parking lot. Hannah had been home for a few hours, sitting at her small kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of tea and a mind full of unanswered questions. She hadn't spoken to anyone since leaving the hospital. No one had reached out. She had started to wonder if she'd just vanish from the system entirely, if what had happened in that hallway would be quietly swept under a rug, lost in the endless bureaucracy of protocol and policy. So when her phone buzzed with an unknown number and she almost didn't answer, it wasn't out of rudeness. It was fear. Fear that it would be HR calling to formalize her termination. Or worse, to tell her that what she had done had somehow made things worse. But it wasn't HR. It was the hospital director. And the message was simple. Mr. Leonard Grayson would like to meet with you in person. 10 minutes later, she was back in her car, hair hastily brushed, blouse straightened, heart pounding. She didn't know why he wanted to see her. All she knew was that Leonard Grayson wasn't just anybody. He was the name. The benefactor. The face on the brochure. The name attached to the wing. And the father. When she was escorted into the private conference room, the mood was nothing like the disciplinary meeting from the day before. No cold stares. No silent judgment. Just one man standing alone by the window, hands clasped behind his back, suit crisp, expression unreadable. He turned when she entered. For a moment, he simply studied her, not like a man judging, but like someone searching for something familiar in a stranger's face. "You're Hannah," he said, more like a statement than a question. She nodded, uncertain. He gestured for her to sit. There was a long pause before he spoke again. Then quietly he said, "I wasn't there yesterday." His voice was calm, but there was a slight tremor, not weakness, but something deeper. Restraint. "I wasn't in the room. I wasn't even in the building. But I heard every note." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the same one he had played earlier that day for the board. He placed it on the table between them but didn't press play. "I have the recordings from the sensory system in my son's room," he explained. "Not video, just audio. We monitor everything. Heart rate, blood pressure, neural activity. It's all part of his care protocol. For 6 months, every time someone new entered the room, a nurse, a therapist, a visitor, his vitals would spike. Heart rate erratic. Breathing unstable. He'd panic. Even if he didn't move." He paused, looking directly at her now. "But not yesterday. Yesterday, when you sang, everything leveled." Hannah swallowed hard. "I didn't know he was your son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Leonard smiled faintly. "You didn't need to know. You just did what no one else had the courage to do. You saw a child, not a chart. Not a diagnosis. Just a boy." She opened her mouth to respond, but found there was nothing to say. No words big enough for what he was saying. "I read the incident report," he continued. "They suspended you for breaking protocol. For stepping outside your job description." He shook his head slowly. "That wasn't a breach. That was grace." He stepped around the table, not imposing, but deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer. "You shouldn't have been fired. A beat. You should have been given a stage." Hannah blinked, unsure if she heard him correctly. A stage." He nodded. "I'm launching a new initiative, a foundation. It'll focus on non-traditional healing therapies for long-term pediatric patients. Music, storytelling, art. Things that reach children where medicine can't." He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. "And I want you to be part of it." She stared at him, stunned. Not just by the offer, but by the clarity in his eyes, the certainty that what had happened wasn't random, or trivial or accidental. It meant something. To him. To his son. And maybe, to more children than she could ever imagine. A week later, the grand ballroom of the Langford Community Center shimmered beneath a canopy of soft lights. Golden lanterns hung from the rafters, and linen-covered tables filled the room. At the far end, a raised wooden stage stood adorned with nothing more than a standing microphone and a single spotlight, simplicity in a space otherwise built for grandeur. It was the annual gala for Grayson Foundation's new initiative, Music Touch, a program dedicated to bringing healing through music to children in long-term hospital care. This was the public unveiling. Donors, physicians, therapists, and community leaders had gathered to show support and write checks. But tonight wasn't about the money. It was about a song. Behind the stage, Hannah stood quietly, palms damp against the sides of her dress. It was a simple navy blue borrowed, slightly loose at the shoulders, but carefully pressed. Her hair was pulled back in a soft twist, and a pair of modest earrings sparkled as she took a deep breath. She wasn't used to crowds. She wasn't used to stages. She wasn't even sure how she had ended up here. All she knew was that Leonard Grayson had looked her in the eyes and said, "You sang when no one else dared to speak. Now, let them listen." So she had said yes. And now she stood here, heart racing, as the lights dimmed and the MC took the microphone. Tonight, we begin with the voice that began it all. A woman who, without being asked, sang a song in a hospital hallway, and opened a door no therapy could. Please welcome, Hannah Blake. Applause rippled through the room. Hannah stepped into the light, blinking for a moment under its warmth. The faces in the crowd blurred, hundreds of them, but she didn't look for them. She looked only at the first row. There in the center, sat Leonard Grayson. And beside him, in a slim wheelchair padded with blue cushions, was Nathaniel. The boy looked different now. Still quiet. Still reserved. But his posture was more upright. His eyes were more alert. He wore a white button-down shirt and navy vest. His small hands rested in his lap, until he saw her. Then slowly he lifted one hand, and touched the sleeve of his father's jacket. Leonard placed his own hand over the boy's and nodded once toward the stage. Hannah swallowed. Then, without music, without accompaniment, she began to sing. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Her voice wavered only slightly at first, but the room leaned in, breath held, silence folding in like a blanket. "You make me happy when skies are gray." She didn't sing for applause. She sang the way she had that first time, softly, honestly, like each word was a bridge to someone who'd forgotten how to cross back into the world. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you." As the final line came, her eyes gently shifted toward the boy. "Please don't take my sunshine away." There was no dramatic swell, no crescendo. Just stillness. In the front row, Nathaniel blinked once, and then closed his eyes. His small fingers reached to grip the edge of his father's sleeve, pulling gently, instinctively, the way he had once held the hem of Hannah's shirt in that sterile hallway days before. Leonard looked down at his son, then up at Hannah. He didn't say a word. He just lifted his hand to his face and wiped away a single tear. No one applauded at first. They didn't need to. Because everyone in that room had just witnessed something larger than performance. They had witnessed return. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, the boldest moves, and the biggest gestures, it's easy to overlook the quiet ones. The ones who kneel beside hospital beds without being asked. The ones who offer songs instead of speeches. The ones whose kindness doesn't come with permission slips or credentials. But sometimes, it is exactly those quiet gestures that save us. Hannah Blake wasn't a doctor, a therapist, or a counselor. She didn't wear a white coat or carry a clipboard. She had no title, no formal training in healing trauma. What she did have was heart. The kind that notices what others miss. The kind that acts, not out of duty, but out of instinct. And that instinct told her to sing. She didn't know that the child sitting silently by the window had stopped responding to nearly everything. She didn't know his heart rate spiked every time someone unfamiliar entered the room. She didn't know he was the son of a billionaire, or that he hadn't spoken in 6 months. None of that mattered. She just saw a boy who looked like he'd forgotten what comfort felt like. And so she offered what she had, a song. Not loud, not polished, not planned. Just a simple lullaby. In a quiet hallway. On a normal afternoon. And that changed everything. We forget, too often, that healing isn't always clinical. It isn't always found in medication, or charts, or lab reports. Sometimes, it lives in the notes of an old melody. In the softness of a stranger's voice. In the gentle presence of someone who shows up when no one else does. There are wounds that don't respond to treatment, not because treatment is wrong, but because the wound is deeper than the body. It lives in memory. in fear, in the fragile spaces where trust used to be. For those wounds, the only language that reaches is tenderness. A song like You Are My Sunshine may seem trivial, sentimental, even childish. But to one little boy, in one small moment, it meant safety. It meant connection. It meant, you're not alone. And to his father, a man who had likely written every check, explored every therapy, and stood helpless as his son remained locked away, that song was a miracle. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. It was human. It was unapproved, unscripted, and undeserved, and somehow exactly what was needed. The lesson here isn't just about music. It's about permission. We live in a culture where everything must be authorized, documented, cleared, and verified. And in many cases, that protects people. But sometimes, in our effort to control healing, we forget that healing doesn't always follow rules. Sometimes, healing arrives unannounced. Sometimes, it walks into a room without a badge. Sometimes, it sings. We must learn to make space for that. To recognize that not all solutions come from textbooks. That compassion is not a liability. That softness is not weakness. We must not punish people for offering light. Because when we do, we risk extinguishing the very thing someone else might be waiting for. Hannah's story is a reminder, a quiet, powerful reminder, that the most meaningful acts are often the smallest. That dignity can be restored with a whisper. That love doesn't need credentials to matter. So if you ever find yourself near someone hurting, don't wait for permission to care. Don't assume someone more qualified will step in. Don't underestimate what your voice, your presence, your melody, might mean. Because someone's healing may be waiting on a moment only you can give. Long after the music faded and the applause died down, people still talked about that moment. Not because it was grand. Not because it was rehearsed. But because something sacred had happened, something few could name, but everyone could feel. It wasn't just about a woman singing a lullaby. It wasn't just about a boy in a wheelchair, or the tears of a father who had nearly given up hope. It was about connection. About the rare kind of grace that slips past fear, past silence, past whatever walls a child builds to survive what no child should endure. In a world full of noise and distraction, Hannah didn't demand his attention. She earned it by being present. By offering something gentle in a place that had grown sterile. By singing not to be heard, but to remind him he still existed. And somehow, in that delicate exchange, something broke open. Not broken like damage. Broken like sunlight through a shuttered window. Because in that song, in that moment, she didn't just sing to him. She reached the only part of him that was still listening. If you've ever done something kind, and been misunderstood for it, if you've ever offered quiet comfort when no one asked you to, then remember this. Someone might have heard everything you did, even if they never said a word. Because sometimes, the heart listens when the ears cannot. And sometimes, a simple song can reach farther than 1,000 explanations. If this story moved you, like this video, and stay with us for more stories where small acts speak louder than the world expects. Tell us in the comments. When was the last time music touched someone, in a way words never could?